choreographer, educator, scholar, and arts activist who specializes in the intersections of Blackness, queerness, and arts activism. As artistic director of Bernard Brown, or BB Moves, a social justice dance theater company, his choreography has been presented across the United States, including New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago, and as well internationally in Seoul, South Korea. Brown's activism has been featured by the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times. He is an assistant professor of dance at Loyola Marymount University and is a certified Katherine Dunham technique instructor candidate. The Los Angeles Times has called him the incomparable Bernard Brown. Mr. Brown.
Actually, Dr. Allender, can we move to the next panelist, please?
Absolutely, absolutely. We're following up with Amber Gonzalez. Amber Gonzalez is an associate professor in the Child of Adolescent Development program and serves in various leadership positions at Sac State, including on the Faculty Senate Executive Committee, the chair of the Academic Policies Committee, and, Faculty Senate Executive Committee, chair of the Academic Policies Committee, and recently she co-chaired the Action Planning Group, Institutional Commitment for the Anti-Racist Campus Plan. Additionally, she recently developed the Demystifying Tenure Learning Community, which supports retention of faculty of color at Sac State. Her institutional and community service activities center on advocating for equity and social justice for students and faculty of color.
Thank you, Dale, my colleague in the College of Ed. I appreciate you. Thank you. So I'm arriving with you all in community to just sort of talk about some of my reflections and institutional analysis, I think, of where we are in terms of educational equity on our campus, and some just thoughts and reflections. So I don't have a full presentation. I was sort of wanting to just come and be in community and have a conversation with my colleagues that were going to sit on the panel, and then in conversation with the audience. And so I think I've only been at Sac State. This is my 8th year at Sac State. And in that short time, I have seen changes, a lot of them through the work of many of our colleagues with CFA. And so I'm super appreciative of that work, but I still recognize that we have a lot of places we need to go. And there's a lot of people that are still being oppressed by our institutional policies and practices. And so last year I did serve on the Anti-Racism and Inclusive Campus Planning Committee, Council, I don't know what we're calling it. I was a co-chair with Antonia Pagahi on the institutional commitment. And the one thing that we kept having a challenge with is that we were being asked to sort of think about what the institution needs, but we hadn't yet talked about what the institution currently has. And so there was never like an equity audit, which is just a tool, it's a fancy way of talking about collecting data on how equity shows up or doesn't show up in certain units and spaces. And we really felt like that would have been sort of the foundation, because it has the potential to inform the process of removing barriers that impede access and opportunity for students, faculty, administrators, but there hadn't been that. So instead, we sort of started after, right? So we sort of, the anti-racism inclusive plan was not built on this equity audit. So we don't really, so while there are a lot of things in the campus plan that are actionable and that we can take action, there's probably a lot of hidden places that aren't even part of the plan because we didn't sort of task every unit to do an equity audit. So I'm saying that because I think transparency is key to holding institutions accountable, and we haven't really seen that transparency come to play currently. So it's hard to sort of think about what we need when we haven't really done a true audit of what we have. I also think in terms of thinking about how we need to move forward, I think in order to prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, it needs to be part of our mission. And it needs to be articulated in job descriptions, policies, professional development experiences. And I think we're moving in that direction. I know we have the faculty fellows who are working with the Division of Inclusive Excellence in terms of working on job descriptions that are going out. But I've already seen some job descriptions this year that trouble me. For example, there's a current job description in one department in SSIS that talks about sort of, it's a basic job description. And there's one line item that asks for a faculty member to be hired as an assistant professor that's going to basically be doing all of their sort of trainings and learning, professional learning communities around equity, anti-racism. And I don't know about others, but I would be really scared coming in as a junior assistant professor, faculty member, and having to take that on. Also with no additional pay, I don't think. And so it just is strange that it's its own individual bullet number 4 in this job description. And so concerning, I don't know if other people have thoughts or reactions to that. The other thing I've heard is I was recently in a meeting where Provost Perez talked about how he wants to work with Faculty Senate to create a task force to examine our current retention and promotion policies, not only to acknowledge, but also reward diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Similar to what Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis did. And so that excites me. But I also think that I'm hopeful that we're going to talk about how our tenure and promotion policies across in UARTP and across our department units do a lot of race lighting. And so race lighting is a term that I've really appreciated from Luke Wood and Frank Harris III, who I think are both at San Diego. I know Luke Wood is, but I don't know if Frank Harris is. But really just refers to the process whereby people of color are questioning their own thoughts and their own actions due to systematically delivered racialized messages that make them second guess their own sort of lived experiences. And I think this happens a lot in our RTP. For example, I see people using certain metrics like H-index or different metrics to determine the quality of publications or scholarship. But a lot of the scholarship that is published or that is working on systemic oppression or systemic oppression doesn't oftentimes get funded and isn't published by our mainstream research journals. And so not even irregardless of the rigor or the quality of this work, yet we still sort of hear from deans and department chairs and even our own colleagues that are sort of saying like, well, is this a quality space for this publication to be? Is this, and what deems quality, right? And we keep putting it on the person to have to sort of discuss what that quality is. It would be fabulous if we just eliminated these subjective terms, right? And a publication is a publication. But I don't know if the institution's even ready to go there. So these are just things that I'm sort of thinking about, questioning as we start to engage in creating an institution that sort of centers equity, anti-racism at its core. I don't know if folks have questions or comments or thoughts.
As a reminder, if folks have questions or comments, you can drop them in the chat.
We're also going to make sure that we have a formal Q&A point at the end as well.
So we can go to the next presenter and then save some conversation time for the end.
Sounds good. I hope folks do have comments or questions about this notion of quality in terms of where our publications show up. I know, and Amber, you probably recall, like I jumped into that conversation because of how publications can be marginalized racially and so on and so forth. So thank you for that. We will move on to our next panelist. Next up is Terry Scott. Terry Scott has been a representation specialist with the California Faculty Association since 2017. In this role, he primarily is responsible for grievance representation, including conducting level 2 meetings with the Chancellor's Office and arbitration hearings, the final stage of the grievance process. Terry also co-chairs co-staffs CFA's LGBTQIA+ caucus and routinely participates in meet and confer meetings with which affect faculty at all 23 CSU campuses. Terry received his BA in history from Cal State Long Beach and subsequently received his JD from Brooklyn Law School. He is a licensed attorney in both New York and California. Thank you, Terry.
Hello, good afternoon to everybody on the call. I just want to say hello to all the panelists and thank you to Sacramento State for inviting me. I think my job description kind of gave you the general sense of what I do, but in terms of relevance to this conversation, up front, as a representation specialist, dealing with representation, grievance representation, we receive tons of inquiries and concerns about discrimination, harassment, pay inequity, workload inequity, very relevant to the conversation we're having here today. And typically it's from, I guess you would say, either a contractual focus or legal focus, but all the concerns are the same. It's apparent what happens not only at Sacramento State, it can happen at Long Beach, it can happen at San Diego, it can happen at Humboldt. But it's routine on numerous campuses and numerous departments. Our CBA, which is entered between the CFA and the CSU, has some general language, anti-discrimination language, which explains the CSU's policy against discrimination based upon numerous protected categories. These specified categories mirror the protected categories of California employment discrimination law, what we consider the Fair Employment and Housing Act, or FEHA. The CSU has its own policies enacted via executive order. I'm not sure, but many of you may be aware that there's Executive Order 1096, Executive Order 1097, both that are enacted to be in compliance with numerous state and federal laws. But in essence, whenever we receive a grievance which claims discrimination, the campus is supposed to investigate that claim. If it's filed by a faculty member, it's typically filed under Article 16, and it's investigated under Executive Order 1096. There may be some participants on this call right now. I know my colleague Janet, pretty sure other faculty can all relate to the frustrating experience it is for any party to be involved with an investigation under that CSU policy, Executive Order 1096. It's no surprise because it's a mechanism by which each campus is supposed to essentially investigate itself or its employees. In my opinion, campuses often fail to be accountable throughout this investigation process, whether this be because of claims of discrimination, harassment, pay inequity, workload inequity. Now, again, in my role, I typically I'm a representative. I'm a representative who's involved once a grievance has already been filed or it's been initiated. But there's also members of the CFA who, whether it be campus advocates or field staff members, who see most of the complaints, who field most of the inquiries from faculty. And some of these don't even make it past the investigation stage. And if they do, these investigations can take months on end to years on end. And again, it could be routinely frustrating, and it's often stretched out, either an elongated process or a very temporary process, which is set to benefit the university and the university's administrative hierarchy. What also concerns me is that there is legal implications for discrimination, harassment, pay inequity, and oftentimes it's difficult to really present a strong claim of discrimination. There's so many levels of evidence that are needed, both in arbitration or in a lawsuit, in the judicial process that can eat up a lot of time and energy. And as a CFA advocate, we always try to counsel, try to advise our faculty that come to us with questions about the alternatives, not only to the grievance process, to the 296 process, but also just the big picture of how you want to be able to resolve whatever issues you're having within your department, within your colleague, within your college, or at the campus level. One of those ways is by organizing. And we're actually seeing this here. And again, I want to reiterate how great this is, how special this is, just to have these type of conversations, to take that big picture look of what's going on across campuses. There should also be mechanisms available to employees who feel harassed, harmed, discriminated against, and that can take place through different avenues such as mediation, which I've seen at several campuses, or just informal mechanisms to resolve disputes, to have conversations amongst faculty, to clear out space, to have some type of resolution for faculty in place that doesn't include the grievance process, which can be in itself a headache, that doesn't include necessarily going through an investigation, which can be frustrating for any party involved. But we're sitting here today having this type of conversation. I was just wondering what was going on maybe 5 to 10 years ago. You know, were campuses allowing these type of conversations to take place? I know at the CFA level, we've done a lot of research, our own research into, I guess you would say, a lot of the inequity that we've seen across campus-wide, and I'm gonna post it. I think I can post something in the chat. We have our Equity Interrupted Report, which was revised in early January 2020. But Jen, if you're able to kind of post that.
Yes, I will. Thanks.
Okay. It does kind of lay out a lot of the kind of system-wide issues we see that affect our campuses, that affect our faculty, that affect our students. Besides that, in terms of the grievance process itself, you know, right now we've had, I want to say, we have over 100 Article 16 discrimination grievances currently being filed system-wide. The average length of time that it takes to have these go through the grievance process is anywhere between a year to 18 months. You know, that can be, that initial year just could be the investigation process, going through a level 1, level 2 meeting. The 18-month kind of deadline is where you get to an arbitration. I think based on our latest evidence, since in the last 20 years, we've had about, let's say, about 200 Article 16 grievances settled, another 200 or so that were withdrawn. Only about 15 have gone to arbitration. 6 have actually we received a negative award. 7 we received a positive award where that grievance was actually granted by an arbitrator. But I'm here to answer any questions that you may have, kind of open up the conversation. And thank you again to Janet, to the faculty at Sacramento State.
Thank you, Troy. This is important information about working conditions and how folks are feeling and what they're experiencing and what they might encounter in that grievance process. So I do hope folks also have questions about that when we get to the question and answer period. We're going to move on to Ryan Fuller. Ryan Fuller is an associate professor in the Management and Organization Department in the College of Business. He's a subject matter expert on crisis communication and conflict communication, having published peer-reviewed articles in those areas. Before joining the faculty at Sacramento State, Ryan earned his PhD in communication from UC Santa Barbara and was an assistant professor in the speech communication department at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. Thank you, Ryan.
Dr. Linder. So I would like to first start by thanking CFA for inviting me to serve on this panel. And I'd also like to thank my co-panelists for sharing their insights and experiences on this topic. I'm a proud member of the CFA, and I've been since I started at Sacramento State in fall of 2016. Before I begin my prepared statement here, I wanted to say that when my colleague, Dr. David Moore, who's in the audience, asked me to speak, I was a little reluctant to do so. I had to take some time to reflect on the request, as well as examine my reluctance. I think addressing this reluctance may speak to some of my colleagues who themselves may be reluctant to take a critical stance of their employer. So my first thought was, I'm a white guy. I mean, you all see that, I'm on video. And am I the right messenger about talking about equity? My next thought was, I'm probably going to make some people mad by speaking up, and maybe there will be consequences for what I say, despite freedom of expression. The answer to my first thought, am I the right messenger to contribute to this panel, was many of my colleagues, my union siblings of color, have been doing the hard work in this area for a long time with limited engagement by white colleagues. Oftentimes, you get asked to do this type of work as service activities for the university for free. I'll repeat that, for free. And especially in light of events that cast a negative light on the institution. I'm one of many messengers, and my message is about allyship. We can't do this important work of creating a more just system without collective action. And I hope that my presence encourages other colleagues who may be reluctant to participate in this work of advancing equity to change their position. The answer to my next thought about making people mad was to think paradoxically, or to employ Janus thinking. Janus is the two-faced or two-headed character in Greek mythology. To think paradoxically means to hold multiple contradictory thoughts at the same time. Let me give you an example. I believe in the transformative mission of Cal State. A college degree opens up great opportunities for our students. We've all seen the joy of our students, particularly our first generation students at college, at graduation, when the president asks first generation students to stand up. And we have data on the economic and social value of college degrees. Even in a system that provides opportunity, there are ugly sides as well. For instance, blatant or hidden examples of exclusionary behavior that cause harm and detract from the mission of the university. I can believe in the mission of the university, transforming our students, giving them opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have, care about my workplace, and also be critical. Being critical serves a constructive purpose of making the university better. I also have faith in the relationships that I built. So these two answers, help me to process and to encourage me to be here today. Dr. Moore suggested that I speak about how organizations affect employee voice behavior. So voice behavior is your willingness to speak up, and particularly what may contribute to speaking up or not on difficult or taboo topics, of which getting the university to move on equity is an example. As someone who studied conflict and crisis communication, the answer about voice behavior is actually fairly straightforward. In my view, values are critical. Values refer to that which we view as important, that which we should or ought to do. Espouse values are when we give words and attribute meaning to those values. For example, honesty, respect, fairness. You can find organizational value statements in lots of artifacts, and our university has many of them. These are policy documents, web pages, marketing materials, strategic plans, anti-racism plans. Enacted values are those that are displayed by our actions when we walk the talk. When we walk the talk, our espoused and enacted values are aligned. When they don't align, there are problems such as inconsistency in an image or reputation, and a poor organizational image or reputation can affect identity with the institution and create stigma for those of us who work here. I promised that my prepared remarks would be brief, and I'm getting to the end of them because I want to have a discussion with my fellow panelists. Values are something to lean on, especially if they're written. On challenging circumstances, I've pointed directly to espoused values to communicate with my colleagues and administrators, sometimes with lots of pushback. And when there's disagreement, I've leaned on the union to help intervene. Fortunately, we have a strong union. So I'll end my brief prepared remarks with a commitment. I commit publicly to taking an anti-racist stance and creating an inclusive campus. I commit to enact these values as I serve my department, college, students, and community stakeholders. I commit to challenging policies and practices that do not follow these values. And I hope that my colleagues will also hold me to account if I don't live up to these values. As I mentioned in the beginning, I hope that my presence here encourages my colleagues across the campus, within my college as well, to make a similar commitment. I look forward to the dialogue that we'll have.
Thank you, Dr. Fuller. Thank you for the commitments. Thank you for starting our conversations in this way. And once again, for inviting our audience to ask questions. And so I encourage questions. We will have a formal Q&A period. I'm beginning to get some of them in. I encourage you also to engage panelists on the specific things that they're asking. They're sharing some valuable, insightful, and vulnerable information. So with that, we're going to move on to our final panelist, and then we'll open it up for a broader Q&A. And so our final panelist, as I started to say at the beginning, erroneously, is Bernard Brown. Mr. Brown is an international performing artist, choreographer, educator, scholar, and artist activist who specializes in the intersection of Blackness, queerness, and arts activism. As artistic director of Bernard Brown, or BB Moves, a social justice dance theater company, his choreography has been presented across the US, including New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago, and internationally in Seoul, South Korea. Brown's activism has been featured by the Los Angeles Times, as well as the New York Times. He is assistant professor of dance at Loyola Marymount University and a certified Katherine Dunham Technique instructor candidate. The LA Times has called him the incomparable Bernard Brown. And so welcome, Bernard Brown. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allender. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm on my AirPods. I just finished teaching class, so I'm a bit shaky, and so I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to take a deep breath. I had to take many of those as I was a faculty member at Sacramento State from 2017 through 2021. And during my time at Sacramento State, it became clear to me that I was one of few African-American assistant professors on campus. And that actually was not shocking, but surprising, considering the diversity that was quoted and noted by the university, something that they touted often as one of the most diverse campuses west of the Mississippi. And so thinking about that, coming from Los Angeles to Sacramento, I was often questioning. I had a lot of questions. I love James Baldwin, and I'm going to paraphrase one of his quotes. I love America very much, and that gives me the right to critique her. And so with these questions, I set about trying to be active in this community, activating change, or at least critical dialogue around what my presence and what the presence of other folks that are considered marginalized. I consider them, us, the global majority. How are we situated in this state institution? What is the purpose? What is the aim? I think back about my studies, my Freirean studies with the pedagogy of the oppressed, and understanding what being an oppressed person in the United States can look like, and how nuanced it is when thinking about my position now as a tenure track assistant professor at a state institution. It was a very challenging thing. I want to say also that I am a first generation college student, first in my family to graduate, definitely the first to go to graduate school, graduating from UCLA. And so I didn't really have a model to follow. I have mentors, but not people at the ready when the things happen on campus. And so going through the tenure process was really, I didn't become tenured or even get to that place, but like every year at this evaluation stage, lots of pushback, as is noted in a lot of studies, even from within my own department. And so the questions around what is an ally? How do allies show up? If they are in this place of trying to survive in this violent system as an oppressed person already, what can they do? What should they do? What are their obligations? What are their allegiances? And how do they yield the power that they do have when trying to help other folks? Something in particular that I wanted to bring up was this process, this evaluative process, the ARTP process. Being in a small department, being one of a very few of the global majority in this department, seeking allyship was complicated. Especially being a junior faculty member, I was thrust into multiple situations where I didn't feel like I had the power, the agency to advocate for myself. I wanted to keep this job. For example, I'm going to go back to the ARTP process, but I wanted to give you a little bit of context. Moments before the AAEOR meeting began, I was asked by my chair 15 minutes before to be the representative for our department. This is within my first semester. And, thinking about what my other panelists have already covered, this idea of voice and how to activate that, I wasn't sure how to do that. I acquiesced and became the representative for the department. And this was at the time that our former vice president for inclusive excellence was just joining our community. And so I mentioned that out loud, being scared, but I said it. Finding strength and courage in that moment was something that I didn't think that I would have, but I did. And it set in motion some things that I'm not going to make assumptions, but things were set in motion. So fast forward a couple of years, I'm in my third year review, and I submit my materials following the similar protocols that I had done during year 1 and 2. And I get my feedback. And it is crazy what happened. Nitpicked, using one student's comments to justify pages of negative comments about my teaching. And and so taking action, I write a rebuttal. I call in special administrative folks to assist me in this process. Like I said before, I didn't really have a model. I didn't know what to do. I didn't think to call the union in, the CFA, right? I did after the fact mention it. But in the moment, my small faculty seemingly turned against me when you would think they would want to retain me as one of the very few people of color in the department on the tenure track line. And so that further urged me to dig into my passions and my experiences and apply for the Anti-Racism and Inclusive Campus Fellowship, which I received and I joined. I want to say hi to my fellow folks from that committee. And that also was wrought with the things that we are often put up against when we're inside the institution, right? Like, how do we not take on the tools of the oppressor to try and reshape this house? We won't, as Audre Lorde has told us. We can't beat the master with his own tools. And so coming in with that in mind, I hoped that that group would really work towards finding alternative methods to reshape our commitment to anti-racism and inclusivity and equity. It was a hard process, right? As was mentioned before by other panelists, not having these things in writing was hard to try and shape where we are coming from to where we want to be. Additionally, how the folks that are often charged with this work are people of color and the allies. And so it is a nuanced conversation. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds. We can talk about this in the question and answer portion. But, what is allyship? How does that show up? Looking at leadership and how it does not necessarily reflect all of the many faces and voices in our community. So really working to implement that into our systems, right? Systemic change. It seemed daunting, and I may be a bit jaded, even in my early career as an academic. But with my lived experience as a Black queer man, I understand that systemic change takes a lot of work, and it's not going to happen in a 9-month commitment. And so with that, it was a very challenging 4 years at Sacramento State, though I can say I am proud of the work that I was a part of with my colleagues. Additionally, it also made it easier and clearer for me that maybe this is not the charge for me now. I'm really thankful for the CFA, I have to say. I feel like the power of the union gave me a sense of protection when I didn't think that I had it. I miss it now that I'm at a private institution where I don't have that kind of protection that I know that is there, not lurking in the shadows, but there. Whenever I need to call upon them, I know where they'll be. So I'm thankful for you all for gathering us here today. I want to say I have a lot of other things that I want to say, but I'm also mindful of the time. Being a planning fellow was really instrumental in helping me understand the breadth of work that needs to be done. It is not just on the personal level, it's very much on the systemic level. It needs to not just be representational superficially, but also deep within the channels of our governance, right? I was an alternate to the faculty senate during this short time at Sacramento State. And I saw, especially when the ethnic studies bill came up, the amount of pushback that happened in our own ranks. And that to me was a bit disheartening, thinking about what ethnic studies as a field has done to this quest for inclusivity at the level of, yes, with our students, but how we interface with our colleagues, and ultimately who and how we're showing up in our institution. And I think that'll be all that I can say right now. I'm excited to be in conversation with this great panel of folks, and also to hear from the folks in the audience. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you for the empathy. Thank you for the affirmation. Thank you for the narratives and the strategy as well. We can see you're getting some thumbs up and some applause around the Hollywood squares here on screen. So thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you, Bernard Brown. Thank you, Amber Gonzalez, Terry Scott, and Ryan Fuller. At this time, we would like to open it up for some Q&A. We have one question that surfaced, and that question is, and I think Dr. Fuller, this may have been for you. If not, it was for Dr. Scott, Attorney Scott. Can the speaker share insights on Division of Inclusive Excellence new bias response tool? It's been mainly a reporting tool for the Division of Inclusive Excellence. Can we also remind, okay, yes. So any comment about that response tool? And so maybe that was for Dr. Fuller.
I think I know as much about it as other faculty, which is that it's intended to report instances of bias on campus. I mean, I think we were all notified about it first via campus news service story. And so I would, I mean, I don't think that I'm the most informed person to speak about it.
No, I put you on the spot because I think the question surfaced during your talk. Because I imagine, Dr. Gonzalez, you might have something to say about it as well. But that's the only reason I targeted you, because it came up at that time. So really, any of you, save him. No, just kidding. Anybody at all can.
I mean, I can speak on it from like what I understand from like a faculty senate perspective, I think. It was developed in consultation with a lot of units on campus, including CFA. I believe CFA was also consulted on the development, and I think it's mirrored after San Francisco State's bias response tool, which is also mirrored, or with a lot of feedback from FIRE, which I apologize, I'm forgetting what FIRE stands for. But it's, from my understanding, it's from students, staff, administration, so anybody can use it, right? Like, and it doesn't have to be an official response. I'm just thinking about if I'm in a classroom and the faculty member is using derogatory language to talk about a specific population, and I'm triggered by that or I'm offended by that, I can use this bias response tool to sort of share that this issue is happening in my classroom. I can be anonymous. I can also share my name, and then somebody from the Division of IE will look at that. I believe it's forgetting their first name, but Bennett is the first name, or is the last name. So Kay Bennett, and I apologize, I'm forgetting the first name. I believe that's the person that sort of, she's the director of the Response Bias Network, and then she sees it. And then depending on what it is, it may go to a particular unit. So it might go to CFA, it might go to OFA, Office of Faculty Advancement, it might go to student conduct, it might go somewhere, or it might just stay in-house and that person sort of has an opportunity to share their story, be heard and validated for what is happening. And then there can be options about mediation. So mediation can be something that both parties go into, especially if it's not a legal case. And so many things that we face, I think, as faculty of color, are microaggressions. And microaggressions, it's really challenging to make a legal case around microaggressions and macroaggressions. I think a lot of what we experience is that. But that's not to say they're not happening and that they're wrong, right? And so this bias response tool is a way to like collect that data, because we don't have any place to collect people's stories. So hearing, for example, what happened to Bernard as he was going through the first semester on the tenure track is wrong. And I think he would have had an opportunity to talk to somebody about that, and possibly have somebody there to help him navigate and help others navigate where this can go. And so that's my understanding. It's a university system. So it's not college specific, it's not student specific, and it's a place for us to collect these stories and hear about what's happening to our faculty, staff, students, and administrators of color, and hopefully be proactive rather than continuously being reactive, which is oftentimes what I think we fall into. So that, I think, is my understanding. I don't know if there's anyone from CFA that can add to that, but that's my understanding from the Faculty Senate Executive Committee.
Well, we actually have a question for Mr. Scott that might anticipate some of what that tail end question to CFA was, Amber, and that is that question comes up directly to Mr. Scott. Is the bias reporting tool a veiled attempt by the administration to circumvent Article 16 of the collective bargaining agreement? And then a follow-up to that, was the tool developed in conjunction with the CFA?
I can answer the first question immediately. I don't think it's a circumvention of Article 16. If a faculty member feels as though they've been discriminated against, they have every right to file a grievance. They have every right to still file a 1096 complaint. Based upon excuse me, the limited amount of information I know about this particular tool, it seems as though, I'm going off of what Dr. Gonzalez was discussing. I want to applaud everything that Dr. Gonzalez was just explaining. It seems as though it's a de-escalation tool. That seems to be one of the reasons it came about, right? It's just, as you said, there's a lot of times where we're in a classroom, we're in an office with a colleague, something's said, or a lot of things happen. There's just an improper interaction, and this is just another way for that situation to be resolved. It doesn't have to necessarily include going through the grievance process or going through a 1096 policy process. It seems as though, now going to the second part of the question, my understanding is that if something like this happened, there's this new kind of policy put in place, it would be announced to the faculty. The CFA could ask to meet and confer, discuss this policy, discuss the impacts of the policy. And my understanding is that that did occur. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm 99% sure Janet or somebody or Margarita, whoever would be involved, probably met and conferred about the specific policy and discussed the impacts of how it could affect faculty. Because, you know, to be honest, this could be something that could be used as a, based upon what I know, you don't want it to be abused in a way that it leads to certain thoughts or certain methods of instruction leading to, you know, either discipline or even trying to impede on somebody's speech, right? So I get that particular concern. I'm 99% sure that this was all discussed in the development of this policy.
Great, thank you so much for that. So I have a follow-up question also for Dr. Gonzalez. Can you comment on the process of how the anti-racism campus plan was created and the context for that question? I'm concerned that many in the campus community had been excluded in the process and no information was provided to the community while the plan was being developed. I also see some hand surfacing, and I'm going to ask if you would direct your questions to chat. And then if when we get through the chat questions, we can speak a little bit more fluidly.
Yeah, so I'm gonna get dates all crazy mixed up, keeping it real. But I know that it happened during COVID, but there was a call to the campus community. And that came through, I think, on a SAC send, as well as a call directly from the Division of IE to faculty, staff, students, and administrators. That call, I think, happened towards the end of fall 2020, if I'm correct. And it basically asked folks if you're interested on serving on this anti-racism inclusive planning committee. And then it had the different, like seven individual action groups. And so, and faculty, staff, students, and administrators could all apply. And it really wasn't like an application. It was, you filled out this like 100-word statement as to why you wanted to serve, and you could actually put your name in to serve on various APGs. So I'll just use myself as an example. I actually applied, I submitted my statement, I nominated myself, I guess that's more of what it is, a self-nomination, to the Mattering and Affirming APG, as well as the Institutional Commitment. The faculty, so I'll speak for the faculty side, the Faculty Senate exec received all of the faculty self-nominations with their 100-word statements. And then as a Faculty Senate exec, we then recommended, I believe it was 2 to 3 faculty to serve on the APGs, each APG. And that was based on their 100-word statement. And then I believe staff went through a similar process on the staff side, and then administration also went through a similar process. And then we recommended those names to Division of IE and the president's office. And so the president and the Division of IE looked at the names, looked at our justification, and we did have like Faculty Senate exec came up with sort of like a rubric, if you will, as to how we wanted to make sure we had faculty who were assistant professors, lecturers, associate professors, tenured faculty, various departments. We couldn't really talk about race and ethnicity because we didn't have that information. It was literally the blurb and their name. So unless I knew that this person identified as a Black individual and they didn't say it in their blurb, I couldn't really talk about that. So the only way that we were able to diversify was based on their blurb. So if they said, I am, like I would have said, like, I'm a Latina or as a Latina, then we know that. But otherwise we were like, no, we couldn't talk about that. And then we ended up with 80, I think, faculty, staff, and administrators. Now I will say there was a goal. There was a goal that we wanted to go to the campus community midpoint, to sort of have open forums about what we were talking about and get feedback from the campus. That was the goal. I think that due to COVID, being in a pandemic, that changed things a little bit. I don't think that there was any intention to not do that. I think that it changed how we could engage with our campus. There were definitely spaces that ideas were shared of how we could do that. But ultimately it was sort of like, well, this is the pandemic and this is sort of what we have to work with. So we weren't able to do that, but that's not to say that they don't want to do that. I think that's what the goal of the convocation that was on September 29th that ended up being postponed. I think that was that goal, was to sort of say, okay, here's what we have here. Here's if you want to think like, here's a shitty first draft of what we have, and let's talk about where we can go from here. But I think due to division of IE, exiting stage left, then I think we were like, oh, we need to pause for a minute and give division of IE time to restaff, right? And it would be great if we could have the vice president be part of that conversation, whoever, I mean, we know who they hired at the time, but on that date we didn't. So I think that's why we decided to take a little pause on having that conversation. But there were lots of conversations across APG. So like, we all met, the co-chairs were elected by their committees or their APGs. And then they had a separate meeting that met like twice a month, I think, to sort of say, this is what's happening on our APG, what's happening on your APG, and how do we sort of think about what each of us is doing so we don't overlap too much. Now, sometimes we were like, no, we got to overlap. This is really important. But in other times we were like, okay, you got that one. Okay, then we're going to go ahead and have a conversation about this other issue concern. Bernard was also on an APG. I don't know if Bernard, if I summed it up a little bit.
You did. Thank you for all of that context, Amber. So good to see you. And I can also add, we had a very short timeline. I want to like punctuate that here. So in the fall, we didn't really get to do work. We were still fleshing out what the structure was going to be for the process, not really able to get into any of the process until the spring. And we were charged with getting all of this done, writing this whole plan for the campus with depth and deep articulation and thought by the end of the semester. It was a lot. And so we really tried to clamor and get community voices into the plan specifically, not just folks that are on the committee, but people in our community and also outside of the campus community. But our scope and our aim was a bit too large for the timeline that we were given. In addition to having the changes of personnel that happened at the end of the process that really sort of charged us to work even quicker than we were planning on doing. As a person who was there as part of the folks putting the language into the plan, I can say that we worked hard to have for the planning fellows to be very diverse. And I know that word is charged and it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but there were folks across colleges, we had students, we had some staff, but they had to prioritize themselves. And so we also, I think, want to say that all the people that started were not the people that finished in this process. So there was a lot of change in that regard that also makes us look at who and how this work is done. Like some people, myself included, I'm going to talk about myself here. I was skeptical of the process from the outset as a person who was invited to be a part of languaging this large outfit, right? And to see some of my fellows like also leave, like exit, like leave early on in the process, not even partway through, was really telling about how folks that have had a longer tenure at the university felt about what the university would actually do with all of this blood, sweat, and tears that we were trying to cram into a very short amount of time. But even with that said, we had long, I'm telling you, like I was meeting with various factions of this group up to 10 hours a week at one point, right? And that's on top of my charge as an assistant professor beyond the probationary period. So I'm teaching like five courses in the fall and 4 in the spring. So we did our best with what we had. And I'm not saying that that's good enough. I'm just here to let you all know, in addition to what Amber said, we wanted to have these anonymous groups, like this telephone booth where folks could come and like tell their stories with their own voice, not just in the written words, so we could hear how it's impacting the physical body, not just the logical mind, right? Additioning to having these speaking circles that we were not able to implement because of the short timeline. So with all these ideas, hopefully they can be implemented over some time. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. And we're going to put you on the spot again. A question for you. Question regarding Faculty Senate pushback against ethnic studies. And I'm reading the question as it's written. Was the pushback based on a lack of understanding of the ethnic studies curriculum, a belief that the curriculum will shine an unwelcome light on laws and systems to promote inequality, or something else?
Well, I can say, as I said before, I was an alternate and I just happened to be called in on that day. And it was very rare. Like, I think that was my first or second time being called in. So I'm not privy to all of the conversation that was happening before that moment. But as I'm sitting there, pretty much an observer, it seemed all of that. And because of that not so clear understanding of what the purpose of what this bill would do, folks were also staking claim to the status quo. Like, well, we are doing okay. So what is the need for more? We have a whole department that is dedicated to this. Why do we need a requirement in the general education component that would do that? What does that do to our hiring processes? What does that do to all of these stakes that we have into the institution as it is, even though we are allies, right? So no one was proposing, like opening themselves up as being like a racist necessarily. And we could clearly see who was opposed to this for reasons that were not clearly articulated. I can say that the folks that came in to support, folks from ethnic studies, professors, and their students, all of these community members that showed up that I assume don't regularly show up to Senate meetings, they were clearly stating their case and why it had value outside of what was being reported as it not having value.
Thank you for that. Amber's hand is up, and I know she was at many of those conversations. So please, Amber, I think you want to respond as well.
Well, one thing that I was thinking, and this isn't necessarily about the actual clause. I was part of these conversations prior, like I guess it would have been in spring of 2019, no, fall, I don't remember. Fall of 2020. Things blur together for me a little bit. But what was really interesting to me was when we enforced the rules. So there was a time when the Senate, when we were in person, the Senate space became very overwhelmed with people that wanted to speak about this. I think, Dale, I remember you having to sit on the floor, right? And there was this sort of like concern about, all of a sudden there was a concern, and a legitimate concern, right, about fire hazard and, you know, how much time you get to speak at open forum. But when we decide to enforce the rules was for that particular bill. When we started to talk about COVID and meeting 6 feet apart, it was I perceived it to be very easy to move us into the union, right, to have that conversation. But we knew that this conversation with ethnic studies, where we had students that wanted to speak, faculty wanting to speak, that needed to happen in that particular room. That is small. I mean, regardless, it's small. You're usually like sitting very close to people that you may or may not know. And yeah, you definitely don't have any room to elbows up, sway to sway. Like that you don't do when you're a senator having to sit at the table. And so I just think it's also something to think about like when are rules enforced versus when do we give leniency to the rules, and who are we protecting when there's leniency and when there's the rules. So not necessarily about the bill, because I distinctly remember when faculty from ethnic studies came together, and sociology, I think, and myself, to sort of have a conversation about developing a referendum to support AB 1460, like many other institutions were doing. It was like, oh, you didn't introduce it correctly. Oh, it needs to be introduced this way. I think Dale was at that meeting when I introduced that referendum and sort of got my wrists a little slapped because I didn't introduce it correctly. So I think when we give grace, when we don't give grace, who we give grace to, who we don't give grace, all of that sort of ties into our idea of equity, right? And wanting to pursue anti-racism as part of our practices and policies. So just something I was thinking about as Bernard was responding to that.
All right, so thank you for that. So I see no more questions, but I do know that there are some announcements as well, some that came forward through the chat. And so I'm going to just ask one last time, any final questions going once? Twice.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment. I don't know if this was mentioned before I got here. Again, apologies for being late. But do we talk about here retention for faculty of color? I just want to talk about that as a person who was not that I wasn't retained. I chose to leave, and I was a part of what I would consider a sort of mass exodus of Black faculty and staff from this institution during a time when it's supposedly focusing on anti-racism and equity. And I would be remiss if I was quiet at this moment. I guess I have a bit more courage as I am no longer an employee of Sacramento State, but I care about this institution. I think it has great potential to do great things. But there are some hindrances, right? In my small department, we had 2 tenure track faculty, Black faculty, I'm gonna just say it. And we both left. She was newer than I, and she left, even though we had just hired another Black faculty member, and we are burnt out, the 2 of us, and we pray for him. I don't know if she prays for him, but I pray for him. Understanding that as the new faculty member that is supposedly called in now to be the arbiter of all things equity, inclusion, and anti-racism, even if that is your area, it is a lot to do, especially as a new person, especially as a person that already has this cultural taxation piece that's attached to their very being in the institution. And so we have to talk about that. I'm so sorry. There has to be something said about that.
Yeah.
Because that is something that is gonna, do we just let that go by? The equity officer is gone. The whole division is basically gutted, right? The person from housing is gone, right? All of these, it matters, right? If we're talking about representation, from the margin inward, where are the margins? Where do they go? I read the article that that outlines the Latinx population and the disparity in terms of faculty and students, right? This huge amount of students that the Latinx faculty are supposed to support and mentor and do all these things. It's how is that even possible? How is it possible? So I'm sorry if I'm like getting like my pitch just gets higher and higher. I'm really passionate about this, and it seems really crazy that we need to talk about it. And I'm gonna just.
I'm just going to underline that 2 times because I have to appreciate that you said it and that you said it at this panel, right? We are at Sac State watching that, and there is an irony of hosting not just this conversation in this moment, but the whole anti-racist campus plan process. And it's in the midst of that process that exodus is taking place. And so on the one hand, I think you're correct. It's definitely a retention issue, but it seemed like something else too, because of the timing that those things are occurring. That's a side eye. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So that means that we need some additional panels, some additional panel time, or that I'll take the liberty as chair of the panel to say, in the ongoing conversations that we're supposed to be having in the various domains that we're in on campus, right? College of Ed, College of what have you, department of this, department of that, committee of such, wherever those are, where we're trying to continue those conversations about anti-racism, we have to enter in this new variable that, okay, while we started off doing this, supposedly in response to some things that occurred, look what else happened while we were trying to do that, right? It mixes the game up, right? It changes the alchemy of the conversation. So those conversations have to accommodate and incorporate that. So I want to thank our panelists again. And I see something coming at me in the chat. Another question. I think this is to the panelists as a whole. When will the true causes of all these departures be discussed in detail? Does it have to come through the collective bargaining agreement? Because we're talking about collective bargaining, I definitely would tip that to Terry Scott, but really this is something that any of us on the panel might want to address.
I'm sorry, can you ask the question again?
Sure enough. When will the true causes of these departures be discussed in detail? And then the second part of that is really where I was thinking of you, Terry Scott. Does it have to come through the collective bargaining agreement? And I don't know if the question is that where these conversations have to come or where? And I also see Dr. Fuller, your hand as well. So
I think the university's response will be, it's a personnel matter. And whenever they invoke it's a personnel matter, that means that you won't hear about it. I wish that the university would be transparent about why people have departed. Yes, I agree with the thumbs down regarding the personnel matter. Look, if the university is committed to anti-racism, it needs to reflect critically on past practices. And if people have disclosed in exit interviews that the reason that they've left is because they felt like it's, an exclusive culture, then that needs to be expressed and shared. And, we need to use our collective knowledge to be able to address that. And I'm sure, I've heard what Bernard has said, and I'm sure that he has, lots of ideas for what the university could have done better to try to retain him and his other colleague who left, as well as, others who have left. And so I don't think that they will say anything about it ever. And I wish that they would. And I don't know about the bargaining part.
And No, Mr. Scott, you were going to step in and say something as well, or no?
No, I can't really. I mean, I was going to ask at least the collective bargaining. I know that the CFA there's certain issues. Well, I'll go back a little bit. One, from what I know, about Sacramento State, as a representation specialist, handling some very highly contentious grievances on that campus is involved. Uh, uh, Essentially, a Black man getting the police called on them for no apparent reason, to seeing what's happened with some, I don't want to get too much into it, but there's another colleague, another faculty member whose spouse was recorded saying disparaging things about Black people, to having an administrator send out an email to Black faculty saying this campus essentially doesn't care about Black people or the things that affect Black people. I mean, there's just enough there to say, hello, there's something wrong, right? There's something wrong, right? Again, that's just from me speaking personally. I'm not speaking on behalf of the CFA. This is me saying how I feel, right? There's something wrong. It needs to be addressed. This is why you have these type of conversations. That's why you get these working groups together. There's smaller issues, not smaller issues, excuse me, not smaller issues. There's individual issues, like what Dr. Brown had discussed in terms of retention, just going through the RTP process, right? That happened, again, not only at this campus, that happened across all the CSUs, probably in higher education as a whole, right? These are all issues that need to be discussed and addressed. Now, does the CFA take on the responsibility in collective bargaining? Yes, we try to make big system-wide type of policies. We try to present those to the table. In collective bargaining, you have to have two sides agree. CSU so far has been, shake their hands, no, we're not going to agree to anything. Go kick rocks, right? But the CFA has been organized around these issues. We've addressed through specific policies about anti-Blackness, especially last year. We've developed plans to organize around that specific issue. As a whole, I think the CFA is determined to get retention rates up for faculty of color. We're determined to get lecturers in the positions of tenure track. There's a whole bunch of system-wide issues we are trying to address, but in terms of what's going on in Sacramento State, it's a lot going on. But I've tried at least trying to illuminate there's a pattern of individual issues that have happened over the past couple of years that certainly point to some concerning, there's something going up at the top that affects all faculty, that affects students as well.
So there's a follow-up question for you, and that is, and you've kind of been addressing it in your comments, and so the speaker's just like giving you a zinger here, directly, bullseye question. So regarding the bargaining part, the question is, can we compel the university through the CBA to release more specifics from those exit interviews?
That's okay. Now I'm trying to get
that
call. I'm like, okay, it's a little bit. We can try, right? You can always send out an information request. It becomes a little bit more difficult if you're dealing with something. If you're talking about an administrator, it becomes a little more difficult. I don't know if we have access to administrative records. I don't know how much access we have to just individual, like an interview. I don't know if there's notes taken or whatever there is. But it is something that could be, at least there's nothing that prevents us from at least sending out an information request, I guess you would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It maybe have to be tied to a grievance, but there's ideas I'm thinking of that I wouldn't say no or close the door on that specific avenue automatically.
Mm-hmm. It seems like there's merit for wanting that information in terms of all of the efforts that are at play to make it an anti-racist place. It just seems the mechanisms for making that happen might not be as easily to to come about. But I thank you for that. Thank you for those reflections. Okay. Further comments, further questions? We got going on some good ones there at the tail end. I appreciate that. Oh, Amber, is your hand up from before? Or is it up again?
No, I wanted to just say, I think this is why, like, I appreciate personnel and I appreciate the privacy of personnel. However, I think this is why equity audits for each unit are so important, because we can't hold units accountable if there's no transparency, right? And I'm not saying I need to know all the details of somebody's exit, but I do need to know the exit interview could be seen as like a data point, right? Like, help me just what sort of themes are coming out from these exit interviews. And I also don't think, I think we assume that exit interviews happen, but Bernard, check me, but I don't think faculty get exit interviews. I think it's up to the administrator, the hiring manager, I don't know who to call them, but they're the ones that just decide. We don't have a practice at Sac State, from my understanding, of doing exit interviews for every person that resigned from the institution. And so I think we don't even have that data, if I'm correct. And please, I see Bernard's hand went up, so maybe I'm going to be corrected right now that exit interviews do happen. But I do think if we had a practice of having these exit interviews, and they could be seen as a data point for us as we do equity audits for each unit at the end of every year, at the end of every 2 years, to understand, are there themes that are emerging as to why faculty, staff, administration are leaving your units? And I think we can't hold units accountable to anti-racism efforts if there is no transparency. And so I think that's why I'm really pushing, I really am pushing for us to engage in some equity audits. But Bernard, oh, sorry, Dale.
No, please, Bernard, follow up, please.
Oh, quickly, because I am looking at the time. So I understand that it is not a practice for doing these exit interviews for faculty. I can say, as a faculty that was asked to do an unofficial exit interview, it caused me for pause. Like, what is going to happen in this? Why are you asking me now? When I've already expressed these concerns in writing, right? In my evaluative feedback rebuttal letter, right? Like, there has been issue for years, and now you're calling me in to find out why I'm leaving. I've already told you. I did them though. I did, and I told them what was what. And I was a bit afraid, even though I was like, there's no more power, right? Like, I have the power, but I was still afraid. And I needed to check that for myself. But I did it anyway, because my fear doesn't necessarily mean anything. The actions, though, could compel folks to do something different. I don't know if they will, because it wasn't an official data point. Like, only the person I was talking to, I think, will ever see those things. Right? And so what Amber is calling for, I think, is really important. Right? And I don't know if there's an objective body on the campus that would be able to do such. And so I'm really thinking about, like, what does objectivity look like? Is that even possible in these processes, right? Because it's already going to seem biased because I'm the one that's damaged or hurt by the system. So maybe there's, I'm a hater ultimately, right? And I'm gonna try to poison the well, when that's not necessarily the case, right? So if there is some system that like this anonymous thing works fine and good, but I need to know that you heard me so that I do not individually get damaged again in this process. And so what does that look like? I'm not exactly sure in this moment, but I do know that these unofficial ones, I was even low key, I know this is recorded, but I'm gonna say it. The president actually wanted to have one with me. And I felt some type of way about that at the end, and we didn't ultimately have it because I didn't press the issue. And so that also makes me look at really quickly, like, what does follow through look like? Are words empty? right? Because people are feeling emotional in the moment, like it's sensational. But then what? Like, what actionable things will be put behind these words? And that was what initially gave me pause about this whole plan. I want to keep saying it, right? So it's called out. I looked at the timeline. Thank you, Janet, for giving us those links really quickly, right? There was a reactive response, and then the follow through is very lackluster. And so how do we hold the folks accountable that are holding us accountable? That, like, the accountability seems to just be passed around, and the people that are harmed continue to get harmed, even in recounting their trauma. And so we have to somehow figure out, how do we put a stopgap, like right away on that? Otherwise, all the other pieces that we keep talking about will continue to happen.
Mhm. Yeah, very important information. I appreciate that you spoke to that in this moment, because here's the living example, right? What occurred during that exit interview process. So important things for us to reflect upon. So I think we are closing out now. Again, I thank again and again and again the panelists for their insights, their reflections, their up-to-date information, and the affirmation and empathy that all of us can experience in this as well. I know that there are a couple of announcements as we close out as well, and I'll ask Janet if she wants to do that. And then I'll thank everyone for attending and continuing to engage in this way with us all. Thank you. Janet?
Thank you so much, Dale. Just a brief announcement that was shared in the chat earlier from a Director of Faculty Diversity Inclusion, Lina Rincon, who's also in the room. She wanted to share that there will be an upcoming presentation at the Faculty Senate meeting to discuss the bias response tool that folks referenced earlier in the conversation. Those details will be shared with the campus once the date is finalized, but just wanted to share that information out. I'll hand it back to you, Dale.